Last time we were looking at the dry principle, don't repeat yourself, in terms of saving Blazor from making two requests to an API, one when it was doing the pre-rendering and one once it had been loaded into the browser for WebAssembly. This time we're going to be looking at how actually the code I wrote for that isn't particularly scalable in terms of if we had more than one API we needed to connect to. Let's just take a look at what we had there, and just for a quick reminder, this was the application as we left it. So if I run that up, we get this Blazor front end, and we can see there that we've got this list of books. And if you'll remember, the point is when I reload, it does the pre-rendering first, and then it fetches the data not from the API, but from the JSON serialization that's been embedded into the page. And we can see that that means it's a little bit more efficient, and we can also see that we get the buttons only enabled once the data has been loaded for the second time. But now let's take that a bit further, because what I had in the API here, as well as that list of dummy book data, we've also got some dummy authors. So let's now have the situation where we're going to display both of those in our homepage. So simply enough, let's go in there, and what I need to do is we're going to need to add, as well as having a collection of books, let's put in a collection of authors. And then let's copy the code that we had for getting the books from the API and change that to be authors. So make the changes in all the necessary places. And then what we'll also do is just change the markup. So if books is null or authors is null. And then also in here are some books and authors. And then I'd already put in the extra table, so let's just comment that out so we can see it just loops through and gives the first name and the last name of each author. And so if we run that up, then we can see that we're getting both the books and the authors, but because of the way I did that, just directly calling the API, we can see we also get that flicker because it's now doing the same thing. It's loading the authors twice, just like it was loading the books twice. So we know how to fix that. We can go in and do that, but the problem is it's going to be quite repetitive, because what we'll have to do is down here in the persist data, we're going to have to put in another one, choose a different key, we'll call this one authors, and then change that to underscore authors. And then we're going to have to take all of that code where we look to see whether we've already got the data cached in the JSON or whether we're going to have to use the API, and we're going to switch that to do it for authors. So we're going to have to put author into there. We're going to have to change that to authors. So that's, remember, just the same key that we put in down there. Change that to authors. And then here we're going to say underscore authors equals authors. And then for the load from the API, we're going to have to just put that underscore authors in there. And so that should now do the same sort of thing for the authors. And so if we run that up, then this time you'll see we don't get the flicker because it's only needing to call the API once, because now both tables are being loaded in the same way when the WebAssembly loads. So that's working fine, but this is where this idea of the dry principle comes in, because we've got quite a lot of code duplication here. All of that code is structurally identical to all of this code, just with the details of whether it's books or whatever being different. And so you can imagine if we had a lot of these to call, we would be repeating the code a lot, and that just makes the code harder to read, harder to maintain, and there's more room for errors. So what we want to do is abstract that out into some kind of system that can make it work really much more simply for every new API we add in there. So let's do that. Let's do it by popping in a new folder. Notice I'm doing this on the client project because this code has to be available to both the client and the server. And the way that the dependencies work is the server knows about the client. So we're going to put it in here. You could obviously put it in a separate DLL, probably more likely in a full-scale application. And in there, we're going to put a new class, and I'm going to call this class Persistence Service. Okay, and so what we're going to put in here is we're going to remember this is going to be replacing a couple of things we've got. It's going to be replacing this subscription and also what we injected, which was the persistent component state. So that's what we'll have. Let's grab that persistent component state and then put it into here. And so we'll have this as a private read-only and then persistent component state, and we'll just call that underscore state. Let's get the namespace for that. And then we'll pop that into the constructor because this is going to be injected. And then also the other one that we mentioned, we're going to have the persisting component state subscription. That one isn't injected. We're still going to need to put it in here, but this one we'll just call underscore subscription. And then same sort of thing we had in the code here. We grab that line of code and then put that into there and then just change the name of that. Obviously, that's going to be underscore state. And then the persist data, let's steal that as well. So we're going to take that persist data and put that into here. Though for now, I'm not going to have any detail in there because we're going to fill that in slightly differently. So let's just leave it as returning the completed task. So that's that first bit of it set up. Now though, let's actually put in the code where we're going to be able to configure this for the particular type of data that we're dealing with. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have a public void, and then we're going to call this register. And what we've got to register for each type of data, so for the author and for the books as our two types of data here, we've got to somehow persuade this service of where the actual data is fundamentally going to come from. So either from that API call or from that API call or wherever it may be. And then also where it's going to go to, so that it's going to go into books or that it's going to go into authors. And we want to do that in a very flexible way. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to pass in a couple of parameters here. The first one, I'm going to have an action, and this is going to be generic for T, where T is either going to be, in our case, the IEnumerable of books or the IEnumerable of authors. Doesn't actually even have to be IEnumerable. We could use this to get single data items back, but that's what we'll have. So we'll make register itself generic for T, and then this action T, I'm going to call the assignment action. And so what that's going to tell us is where to put the data when we've got it, which is to say either into books or authors or whatever. But remember, the other thing we need to do was we need to know where to get the data from. And so that's going to be done with a function that's going to return a task, because these are very often going to be asynchronous. And again, for that data type T, and that's going to be called the creation. So that's where we actually create the data. And let's not put anything in there for now, because I just want to show you how we're going to use this, because I think that'll make a bit more sense. So let's go back to our home, and what we're going to do is at the top we can get rid of the injection of the persistent component state, because that's now in our service, and we're just going to put in here our persistence service and get hold of the namespace for that, and we'll call this persister. And then what we can do down here is essentially what we need to do is we'll say persister dot register, and then we'll deal with the books first. Remember, the first thing is how we assign it. So we're going to take the parameter, which I'll call books. Very irritatingly, the editor changes that, but that's not what I want. I want it to be called books because that's the parameter to the lambda. And then I simply say underscore books equals books. So that's basically that fragment of code we've got there. We've now put into this lambda. And then the other thing I want is we want to have this function. It takes no parameters, but it's going to be async. And that is basically where we're going to have the code that gets the data, which is that chunk of code there. So if we just copy that, put that in there, then we can see that that's going to make that call and everything's going to be happy there. And then we can simply duplicate that and do a similar one for our authors. And so that one should do the same thing. Obviously, it's not doing anything as yet, but the point is that's how simple it should really be in terms of doing the registration. And in fact, something I find a bit neat, and certainly something that's quite popular these days, is what's known as a fluent way of doing this. So I'm actually going to change this slightly, and I'm going to return here a persistent service. And then on the end of this, we can simply say return this. And what that means is I don't have to keep saying persister.do that. I can just chain those together, looking something like that. And that'll be a bit neater, particularly if we get lots and lots of these things. Probably also a little bit tidier if I lay them out slightly differently so we can see both of those steps going along. But that's essentially all I want to have to do inside the code here. So really we should be able to get rid of that and get rid of the whole of that as well. And a few little other things we'll do, but basically that's all we'll need to be doing. So let's actually make that work now. So if we go back to our persistence service, and we're not going to do very much with this assignment and creation as yet. We're going to have to store them up and make use of them later on. So what we're going to do is in here, so we'll make this again private read only, and it's going to be a list of functions that simply return a task, and I'm going to call these registrations, and we'll initialize that to being empty. And then in the register, we're going to say underscore registrations dot add, and these are going to be asynchronous functions, take no parameters, but then what it's going to have to do is this. Now, let's remember things we have to do. First thing we have to do, if we go back to what we had, let's just do a few Control Zs here. Remember, when we have any of these data items, we have to persist it via a key. So we've got that key, either books or authors, to put it into the JSON. And then, as we saw here, we need to use the same key to get that out. So that's something we're going to need to put in our persistence service. And the way we're going to do it is like this. I'm just going to, in here, put a private int that I'm going to call next key. So that will start at 0, and then just we're going to increment it each time, because there's no need for the names of those keys to be meaningful at all, as long as they're unique, and when they're called on the server to put the data into the JSON, use the same key on the client when you take it out of the JSON. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to here say var key equals, and then we'll just do a bit of text, doesn't really matter much, but it's going to be that, and then we'll do ++ underscore next key, so that will give us a unique key that we can have for each one of them. And then we're going to use that to see if we can fetch out the data that we want. So what I'm going to do is say underscore state dot try take from JSON, and remember that try take from JSON, again, if we do a few Control Zs here, that's what we were doing down here individually on each of the books of the authors. And so we're going to try take from JSON, and this is going to use that key, and then it's going to use an out for the data type T, because remember this is generic, so that's either going to be IEnumerable of books or IEnumerable of authors in our case, and we'll just call that something general, we'll call that data. So that's going to try and fetch that out. Now, I haven't put that in an if statement because previously we could see whether that succeeded or not. But the other way we can see if it succeeded or not is simply if we've got any data. So if that data is null, we know that we haven't got any data. If it is something, we have. So basically this function that I'm putting together at the moment, this lambda, is going to be called twice, once on the server side, once on the client side. And on the client side, we will get some data because it will fetch it from the JSON, but on the server side, we won't. And so, neat little way we can do this without if statements. I can simply say data, and then I can use the wonderfully named null coalescing assignment operator, the double question mark equals, and then I can say await, and then call that creation function that we've got there. So what that does, very succinctly, it has a look in data, and if data is not null, if we've got some data, it does absolutely nothing. Whereas if data is null, it invokes that creation function and puts the result into data. So we can see what happens here. As I say, this code will be executed twice. First time on the server, we won't have any data from the try take from JSON, and so it'll invoke the creation function, which will make the API call. But then the second time, when this same code is run on the browser, then we will get some data, so we don't need to call the creation function. So it achieves exactly the same as we had before. What do we then need to do with that data? We need to take that data and put it into either books or authors or whatever, and that's what this assignment function was all about. There's setting the books or the authors. So having got the data from either the API or from the local JSON, we then simply say assignment and then pass in the data, and that will mean the data either goes into underscore books or underscore authors. And then finally, we're going to have to do one more thing. We're going to have another collection on here. So we're going to have another private read only, and this is going to be a dictionary, and the key for that dictionary is going to be a string, which is actually going to be the key that we were creating earlier on. And then rather flexible, the value is simply going to be a nullable object. And then I'm going to call this simply data and initialize that to empty. And then the data I've got here, I'm going to put that into that dictionary. So I'm going to say underscore data, open brackets, key equals data. And we can see that's why it has to be of type nullable object, because that's the only way that can all go in there for the different types that we're dealing with. We'll see why we need to put that in there later on, but that's essentially what we're doing. So every time somebody registers, we take the assignment and the creation and we put them together into this function that's going into registrations that will then either get the data using the creation function if we're running on the server side, or it will get the data from the JSON if we're running on the browser side, and then put it into the actual variable, which remember is going to be either underscore books or underscore authors. Okay, so that's our register working fine. Next thing we have to do is get that persist data working, and this is why we needed that list of data. So remember again what happens in the persist data. Again, if we do the control Zs, this is where on the server side, using the particular key, we need to assign the data items into the JSON so that they can be passed over to the server. So what we need to do there is in here, we simply say for each, and then it's going to be var item in underscore data. And then what we're going to do with that, we're going to say underscore state dot. So there's our persist as JSON, and we just want the key. Well, remember, this is a dictionary, so the item's key value pairs. So the key is the key that we want, and then the value is the value. So that's going to loop through as many things as we've registered and effectively do exactly the same as that. Okay, now there's one last thing we've got to do, however. Although we've got these registrations, those have not been executed yet. So one last thing we do is we're going to have a public method, and this is going to be async, and it's going to return obviously a task, but a task generic for, and then this persistent component state subscription. That's the subscription we've got there, because basically you can see if we look once again at the code here, and again take it back a bit, the first thing we had to do when we were doing it all by hand was get hold of that subscription. So that's what we need to do there so that we can still have the subscription. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to call this build, and then what I'm going to do is invoke all of those registrations, and I'm going to do them asynchronously, so I can just do an await and then task dot when all. So I think we covered this in a video a while back on the task parallel library. What when all does, it'll do an await, so it'll carry on doing whatever else it needs to do, and then that will return when all of the tasks you pass to it have completed. So what we can do here is just say underscore registrations, but then remember the registration is just the task. We need to invoke the task. So the way we can do that is a dot select, and then we can say on R for registration gives, and then we simply invoke it, and remember these take no parameters. So that's what we're doing there. That will return the task, and then when all of those tasks are completed, so when this code is executed for each of the data types, the books and the authors in our case, then that will mean all that code has been executed. Because remember, the code we have there was, again, let's do another control Z, basically the same as the code we had there. So it does need to get executed at some point. And then finally, as we saw, we've got to return the subscription. So that's all we do there, and that's everything working. There's one other little thing I want to do here actually. We've got this as a service. Ideally, services should go through an interface. So let's just do a quick extract interface on that, call it iPersistent service. Looks like we've got everything we need, just OK on that. And then also, just one other thing to do, notice here we're returning the actual type. So we'll change that to an iPersistent service, and then back in here, when we do the injection, we'll change that to iPersistent service. Shouldn't make much difference. But then the last thing we need to do therefore is on this persister, after we've changed together the registers, I'm just on the end of there going to do a dot build, and that, as we saw, will therefore execute all of those functions that we had registered down there. But also it returns the subscription, so we're going to say here underscore subscription equals all of that, plus of course that's an async call, So we're going to await that, and that will give us all of those that we want to do. So we get the subscription back, having registered each of them, and then finally done the build that makes it all work. And now that subscription is still going to work there because we've got to dispose of it. So that's all going to work okay. And then there's only one last thing we have to do, which is we've got to make sure that's configured properly. And so what we need to do is go into the program, and just on here, we're going to say builder.services.add transient, and then this is going to be the persistence service and then the persistence service. But what you have to remember to do, this code, remember, executes in both the server and in the browser. So we've got to put it in both programs, even though it's going to behave in somewhat different ways. So we also want to put that in here as well. And that means it'll get executed on both sides of it. And so let's run that up, check it's all working. And it isn't, because one thing I forgot to do when I changed the return type on there to use the interface rather than the class, I forgot to change it on the interface itself. So that actually has to change in there. So now if we run it up, then if we look at that, we can see it's doing what we wanted to do. So we saw, let's just reload it. You can see we get the pre-rendering, and then when the details become enabled, that shows that the on-init has been done within the browser. So we didn't get any flicker, everything working fine. But the point is, it all worked with rather less code. Certainly there's a lot of code to put together the persistence service itself. But the point is, once we've done that, the actual code for this component and for potentially dozens of other components, because this is going to be used again and again and again, is now much, much simpler. So I think it's a trade-off that's worth having. Let's just, though, walk through this a little bit. So let's go to that persistence service. And what I'm going to do is put a few breaks in there. Let's put a break in this register, but let's also put a break inside there. And let's also put a break in this persist data. And then let's again do a reload so we can see the whole process. First thing we're doing is we're coming in and we're registering the books. You can see that that assignment has a type of book on there. Then if we carry on from there, this time we're registering for the author, and we can see both of those have just come in on this on-initialized async. But remember, at the moment we're running in the server. If we carry on from there, then we actually execute the first one of those. Now this is now happening in the build, which is still running on the server, as we can see in there. And so this first one is going to generate a new key. That's just going to be key 1. It's going to try to get the data from JSON, but of course we're on the server, so it's not there. So it will get the data from the API and then assign it into the appropriate variable and store up that data key. If we go around again, we're getting the second one called. If we go around again, we then hit the persist data, and in this data array we should have the 2 items, which are going to be the data for the books and then the data for the authors, and we're going to persist those. That should be all the work done on the server. You noticed it displayed the browser. We can still go back to it very briefly. You can see that that's the pre-rendered version. But now we come in here again, go through the same sort of process again, because we're still running the on-initialized async, but now we're running in the browser. And so we register one, we register another, then we do the build, remember, and so now we generate the key, and the key is going to be exactly the same because the order that these get executed on the server are going to be the same as the order they get executed on the browser. So we'll get the same key, so that's still key 1 the first time round. We try to get the data from JSON, and this time, of course, we do get some data because we're on the server, so we don't need to do the creation. We then do the assignment, and you can see it's going into there and assigning that into underscore books, and then carry on and do the same thing with the next one. So key 2 is going to be for the authors, and then if we go that, we don't hit the persist data this time because we're on the browser, and that's all working fine. So quite complicated what's going on with all of that, if I just clear all those breakpoints. But it means that we get this nice efficient code in terms of only calling the API once and getting the pre-rendering, but also with the benefit for most of the developers, they just have to understand how to write that little bit of code, and the hard work, although it was quite complicated code, only needs to be written once, and that's going to be reusable again and again. So that was quite a complicated bit of code, but I think it's a nice example not only for this specific situation of when we're trying to deal with the persistence on pre-rendering, but how you can abstract out what might otherwise be quite complex functionality into a service and make it relatively easy for users to take advantage of it. As we saw, that's the code that typically users have to write, even though the code we had to write was more complicated. And it made use of some quite nice features, quite nice use of generics, of async and await, of lambdas and that sort of thing. So I don't expect that people will immediately think, oh, that's obvious how that works. Hopefully I've gone through it fairly clearly, but download the source code, make use of it for yourself if you want, but that's something that you should be able to find is very useful when you're trying to persist when you're dealing with pre-rendered Blazor. So I hope you enjoyed that. Got a few more things to do in this area. One thing we've got to work out, how can we unit test this sort of thing? Because that's quite complicated. We're going to have to do some extra work to unit test it, and that's what we're going to be looking at next time. So if you want to look at that, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you for the video on testing.